Before millions of pages of Epstein files were released, before politicians and former princes in the UK stepped aside and came under criminal investigation, before powerful men all across the United States had to step down from their positions of power because of their ties to Jeffrey Epstein, before Epstein died in prison, before he was indicted by a grand jury in 2019, before all of that, Spencer Kuvin was in the middle of the Epstein case for good reasons. Mr. Kuvin is a lawyer who now represents or has represented 9 different survivors in the Jeffrey Epstein matter. He, in fact, represented victim number 1, as we call her in the media, 14-year-old girl who came forward to authorities about her relationship with Epstein back in 2005 that initiated the first investigation, or one of the first investigations in Palm Beach County. Spencer Kuvin, thank you for having a seat with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you having me on today.
You know, if you're like me, these files come out and every day there are new revelations and it's almost hard to keep track. And when I start looking at these files and the different things that have come out, I find myself losing my life for 2 to 3 hours at a time, just trying to follow the narrative here. But there's so many different veins of this story. Have you ever seen anything quite like it in your entire career?
Honestly, I never have, and I hope I never do again. But you have to go back in time and you have to kind of think back to the time in which this was occurring. You're looking now back into 2005 and 2006. This is before the Me Too movement. This is before Harvey Weinstein. This is before Bill Cosby. This is the era of, young girls who are being groomed by Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein. They're being promised modeling careers. They're being promised careers in art, going to school, paying for scholarships. And then they're being enticed to these different mansions and islands. And when I first heard the story from my client, who at the time was only 14 years old, who was brought to my office by her parents, it was unbelievable. I didn't believe it. It sounded like conspiracy theories. It was absolutely unbelievable until I met with the lead investigator at the time, who was Joe Riccari. And he laid out exactly what had been occurring there on Palm Beach Island for likely some time.
What did she tell you? What did this 14-year-old girl say? How was she initially recruited into this scheme?
So this story really started in a high school here in Palm Beach County, in the western counties, which is an area called Royal Palm Beach. And it was Royal Palm Beach High School. These were young girls who had attended events or parties on the beach during the weekends. And one of them in particular, which was a young lady by the name of Haley Robson. I can tell you her name because she has been out publicly and has disclosed her name publicly as one of the—
She's been on this show, as a matter of fact, Haley has, yeah.
So Haley was approached by Sarah Kellen and Nadia Marcinkova. These were 2 girls that were in their early 20s, living with Jeffrey Epstein, traveling with him. And Haley was told to come out to this house, and for some money, $200, $300, she could meet with this older man, give him a massage, and then go home. Well, Haley then does that, and then subsequently decides she doesn't want to anymore. So then he tells her, if you bring other girls from your high school, then you don't have to do this. And I'll give you $100 just to bring other girls. So that's what Haley did. She went back to Royal Palm Beach High School and recruited a number of other young girls, including how we now know her, victim 1, who was 14 at the time. And she was enticed to come out to the home on false pretenses and then basically stranded there. This is the day of yellow taxi cabs. There was no Uber. There was no Lyft. There were no cell phones to use. And she is stuck in a home where she's then led upstairs to a massage room where Jeffrey Epstein gets naked and expects a massage.
And besides asking for the massage, what did Jeffrey Epstein do to your client, this 14-year-old high school student?
So once he had these girls in this locked massage room, he would either begin to pleasure himself while touching them. He would ask them to disrobe, tell them they needed to take off their tops, take off their bottoms, and then he would begin to touch them while pleasuring himself in the massage room, ultimately to completion. And then the girls would want to just get out. So as best they could, they would try to leave the room and talk to the women that were there at the house in order to be able to get a taxi cab to be able to get home.
What made this girl finally tell her parents what was going on so they could contact you to pursue justice?
So there was an incident at the school. Apparently, word had gotten around about Haley Robson and her requests to bring girls to this home on the island. And other girls were saying nasty things that high school girls say to one another in those situations, calling them different names. And they got into a disagreement and a fight and altercation. And then a school administrator thankfully got involved, recognized the dispute, and brought it to the attention of this young 14-year-old's parents. And that's when parents realized that she needed to immediately go to police, which is what they did.
And when you went to police, when the family went to police, when you got involved in this case, what was the reaction from local investigators? You mentioned earlier that they were already aware of these allegations, but where was the case at that point?
They were still in the investigative stages. This is early on. We're talking 2005, 2006. And they were still surveilling the home. They were outside of Epstein's home for numerous days and weeks. They were doing trash pulls. So they were following the trash truck and they were doing pulls of his trash at his home, looking for any evidence they could collect, which they did. They collected different sex toys. They collected massage oils, different things there at the home that he had thrown out, message pads. And then they were videotaping young girls going in and out of the home on a regular basis. So the investigation was definitely underway. And then they started interviewing other young girls. And it turned into a web of interviews because they would interview one girl, she would lead them to two more or three more. And then those girls would then lead to even more young girls that had been brought out to the home.
Why weren't criminal charges brought earlier in this matter? It seems like they had a lot of evidence between the trash pulls, the surveillance, witness statements. I mean, there were crimes committed here.
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. And it's really kind of sad because back then, we were going to the state attorney's office here in Palm Beach and talking about how this was awful and widespread, and we were basically being ignored. They were shutting the doors in the face of numerous different victims that wanted to come forward and ended up where they just focused on one or two girls. And then they proceeded to bring the grand jury charges, which they themselves ended up tanking. I have even one worse, though, with the disclosure of the records that have recently been released by the Department of Justice. What I found in those records was the fact that back in 2001, 4 years even before my client went to police and began the investigation, they had stopped Ghislaine Maxwell because of a report from two Palm Beach Atlantic students who had been approached by Maxwell to come out to the home. And that investigation ended up being dropped and went nowhere. So that was an opportunity to stop him even back then.
Well, I saw that, and I wanted to ask you why you think that was. Why did they cut her loose with very little follow-up investigation?
I think the only thing I can think of, and remember, we've got to put ourselves back into the minds of those investigators back in 2001, which thankfully I believe that the police departments have gotten a lot better now with a victim-centered approach to investigations. But back then, they had two young adults. These were girls that were over the age of 18 who were approached by Ghislaine Maxwell. And I think that back then it was looked at as, these are college girls that either chose to do something they wanted to do or were convinced to go somewhere, and that's it. So I think that they were looking at it where they didn't believe that any crime had been committed other than some rich guy on Palm Beach Island wanting to meet with 19, 20-year-old girls.
But girls who were of the age of consent. And it seems to me, Spencer, that Epstein and Maxwell and their associates worked very hard and continued to do so for years to create this image of, yeah, it's sleazy, it's racy, it's swinger like, but all these girls were of age, they consented, and they were paid. They were compensated for massages or whatever else went on. Am I right there?
Absolutely. In fact,
I mean,
you
it's
know,
horrible, and
it
it
is.
is human trafficking by today's standards, but they were successful in convincing law enforcement and a whole lot of other people, it seems, that this was, racy, untoward, inappropriate, but perhaps not illegal.
He was convinced of that. Chris, I can tell you firsthand from sitting down across from the predator himself during both two depositions that I took of him, one that only lasted a minute and another that we were court ordered to go back and he had to sit for 6 hours. But then again, in a private mediation that we had on the cases, he was trying to convince me, an advocate for the victims that he knew was advocating for these young girls, that he had done nothing wrong. He was absolutely convinced. And he would say to me, listen, age is just a number. What's legal in one country may be illegal in another. What is legal in one state in the United States may be illegal in another state in the United States. It's a number that's selected arbitrarily by politicians. So why should what I do be morally wrong if, like you said, Chris, I'm paying them and they're coming here voluntarily? Who's to say anything I'm doing is wrong?
But at
He was
some point,
absolutely
yeah,
convinced,
at some point, I mean, 14 is 14, 13 is 13.
clearly.
Holding somebody or coercing somebody or grooming somebody is illegal. And then there's a whole issue of human trafficking and running a prostitution ring. The depositions. I cannot imagine a guy in your position, or a guy in my position for that matter, having the ability to get him in a room and ask these questions on behalf of a survivor. You talk about a feeling of avenging somebody who was victimized, and holding them accountable. Take me into and let's set the stage here. When you did the first deposition with Jeffrey Epstein, this was during the time he was sentenced to this sweetheart deal after the feds backed off and he pleaded essentially to prostitution with somebody underage. He was given a sentence that he was allowed to serve.
Which, by the way, was an insult to the victims themselves,
What was a
essentially
huge
calling
insult?
these
I mean,
minor girls prostitutes.
yeah, when have you ever seen a sentence like this in the history of practicing law? I've never seen
Never,
anything like it.
never,
I
never.
mean,
And listen,
I'm
I
disturbed
work
by
with former
seeing,
they had never
yeah,
seen it.
yeah, I'm disturbed by seeing guys go away only for 5 years on child porn charges,
Yeah.
much less this deal. So you actually did the questioning. You sat with him for the deposition while he was serving this sentence. Set the stage for me.
So you've got to understand that even before we got in that room, there were discussions had between the lawyers, myself and Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers. Why do you want to take his deposition? He's only going to take the fifth. He's not going to give you any answers. This is a waste of time. You shouldn't, be bothering with this. And then motion practice and with the court, motions for protective order. He's got an ongoing criminal investigation. Mr. Kuvin shouldn't be entitled to take his deposition. It could jeopardize his criminal case. We had to go through all of that, which took months upon months just to get to the point where I could get him in the room. Then at that point, it was my team that helped prepare me to try to figure out a way that we could elicit some usable information from him, if possible. So working with my team, which included psychiatrists, counselors, professionals in the field of trafficking, and we would sit down and go through what we thought we would want to ask strategically. And ultimately, after hours of going through this and contemplating questions to ask, we came up with, listen, we want to see if we can antagonize him enough to where he would get upset and say something stupid on the record, on video. Alternatively, knowing that he was a very egotistical narcissist and felt he was always the smartest one in the room, question him in a manner that he understood that he was going to have to listen to this and he was not in control anymore. So ultimately, we had a list of about 10 questions that I could potentially ask as one of the first questions to him. And it came down to the ultimate question, which I asked him because it went to the heart of what the case was about. It was about not only attacking his ego, but attacking his manhood. And then tying that directly to the evidence in the case, because asking him about his manhood, how would a 14-year-old know how to describe it if not for something illegal having occurred? So I could show that it was relevant, but more importantly, I could show him I didn't care who he was or what power he had or wealth he had. I was going to ask him anything, including about his own personal manhood.
Do you remember specifically how you posed the question about his penis?
Isn't it true, sir, that you have what has been described as an egg-shaped penis?
And he reacts how?
He smirked. I think he understood. And he kind of smiled and looked over at his lawyer, kind of lowered his reading glasses, like, can you believe that this kid is asking me this? And then his lawyers step in and object. And then I go, listen, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm just reading from the probable cause affidavit from a 14-year-old that described your penis as egg-shaped, wide at the base and thin toward the top. And then that was it. That was enough for them. They said, that's it, we're done. And they terminated the deposition and he got up and walked out.
A lot of skincare looks great on paper, but doesn't deliver. And somehow we're told we need 10 different products for real results. That's why OneSkin stood out to me. Founded by PhD longevity scientists, the brand focuses on real science, not hype. They asked, if visible aging is driven by damaged senescent cells, why not target them directly? That research led to OS1, their proprietary peptide designed to slow skin aging at the source. I was drawn to the science-first approach and clinical backing. And listen, I travel a ton. I'm on airplanes. My skin gets dry, and that's why I've been using OS1 Face and love how lightweight and smooth it feels. My skin looks more even and resilient. It's simple, effective, and refreshingly straightforward. I use it every day. Born from over a decade of longevity research, OneSkin's trademarked OS1 peptide is proven to target the visible signs of aging, helping you unlock your healthiest skin now and as you age. For a limited time, try OneSkin with 15% off using code Hansen, Hansen, at oneskin.co/Hansen. That's 15% off oneskin.co with code Hansen, Hansen. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. You were able to send a message, though, to Epstein and his team that, look, you may have got this sweetheart deal in the criminal matter, but you are going to be chased down civilly, and we're not going to let you go. And we've got the goods because our survivors, our victims, have information that proves the truth and veracity of what they're claiming here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what was so frustrating back then was that not only were the state attorney's office kowtowing to Epstein's lawyers and deciding not to bring charges. But even the federal government, who oftentimes we look to as, the agency that can actually get something done when it comes to a big, wealthy, powerful predator like him, they dropped the ball. So the only people that were left were, frankly, the civil lawyers that could continue to go after him. And not only him, but also any of the people within his orbit. And we wanted him to be aware that we weren't going to stop. We would continue until the job was done. And if that meant uncovering everything about his organization, we were going to do it. And we did.
What has surprised you most, Spencer, in terms of what you've seen come out all these Epstein files, the millions of pages? It's hard to keep track with it, and I know that you've got other legal matters that you have to attend to, but you monitor this. What has shocked you the most of all this?
I think what really shocks me now is the scope and breadth of his power and influence that even the civil lawyers like myself didn't know back then, were unaware of the true scope of it. We had heard rumors, he's friends with Trump. He is, flying around on planes with Bill Clinton. He's, socializing with all of these wealthy, powerful people. Those were kind of rumors in the background in the original litigation. But to now see the true breadth and scope of his power and influence with those people, and the fact that he was bringing people to his pedophile island and coordinating these events with very powerful individuals. These are things that people back then would have been called conspiracy theorists. But the reality is Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of a conspiracy because it was true. All of this is
Absolutely.
proving to be true. And it's just sad and frankly very scary that this alternate universe of powerful, wealthy individuals were doing this right under the noses of everyone, including the federal government.
You know, you as a lawyer get to look at some of this material as part of discovery. Now, as a reporter, I wish I could get the FBI 302s and all of these
Right.
uncorroborated reports in every criminal investigation in which I have interest. It would be a reporter's dream. It very rarely happens because some of the information is not corroborated. Some does not rise to the level of being
Sure.
potentially prosecuted. So there is this added level of having to be responsible with some of this stuff that comes out. And I think most major publications have done that. I often note Julie K. Brown's work because it was groundbreaking and it shows the importance of
Yeah.
local news. And without that work, many of these survivors wouldn't have come forward. And the Southern District of New York wouldn't have been able to indict the case in 2019.
Correct.
But how do you balance, what could be absolutely untrue or unverified with, oh my God, there are allegations that even the president of the United States knew about some of this stuff, which he denies. He claims that once he heard about these things, he cut ties with Epstein and even went so far as to report some of this to the local police. But there are allegations out there from people, survivors who are now adults, who claim differently. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, look, as part of my job and what I do almost every day is to listen to survivors' stories, whether it is Jeffrey Epstein or Bill Cosby or any of the other, unfortunate favorite individuals that we see that I've heard allegations about as part of my practice, and try to figure out the truth behind what they're telling me versus what may be a fanciful story from someone who just may have issues.
Or
And
somebody
that's
who
not
might think something, but is not recalling it properly, or might have been in a haze with substance abuse.
yeah,
A lot of things
or
can happen.
may have mental health issues.
Sure.
Who knows? I feel for those individuals, but I listen to them nonetheless because you never know where the truth is and where it may just be a fanciful story. But what we do is we try to validate what they're saying with corroborating evidence. And I'll give you a good example, right? One of the victims I represented who actually went public with her story was Caroline Kaufman, I filed her case up in the Southern District of New York after Epstein passed away in jail. And her story sounded pretty out there. I mean, it sounded unbelievable. She's invited to a party in Manhattan. She's recruited at an event for horses up in upstate New York. And she goes down to the mansion where she's then let in, where she goes into a party. She sees all these people, including Prince Andrew at this party. She's escorted upstairs and she's proceeded to be raped by Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, on its face, you listen to that and go, she could be making that up. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So then we started to dig deeper, and I was able to find a person, an independent witness, that had actually driven her down to Manhattan and dropped her off, and then subsequently picked her up from Grand Central Station after what had happened, and she was in tears. And we were able to backtrack and find travel receipts, toll receipts, records, information to validate that he had made that trip. It's evidence like that where you then go back and you try to help the victim through that process and make sure that they can tell their full story, because no matter how crazy it sounded at the outset, the reality is it likely occurred and she was a victim.
This is a product I have been using for more than a year, way before AquaTrue became an advertiser here. But listen carefully, because this is something I know that works. Did you know 3 out of 4 homes in the U.S. have toxic chemicals in their tap water? Even though contaminated water looks clear, it could put you at risk for devastating health concerns, including fatigue, hormone disruption, cognitive decline, even cancer. It's all true. Surprisingly, standard fridge and pitcher filters do little to remove most contaminants. And bottled water, well, that contains microplastics. So what's the solution? AquaTrue is the countertop water purifier tested and certified to remove 84 contaminants, including chlorine, lead, forever chemicals, and microplastics. Its patented 4-stage reverse osmosis system goes way beyond ordinary filters for pure, healthy water you can trust. No plumbing and no installation. AquaTrue has been featured in Business Insider, Popular Science, and named Best Countertop Water Filter by Good Housekeeping. And I know it works. Join 90% of customers who say their drinking water is cleaner, safer, and healthier. Head to aquatrue.com now and get 20% off your purifier using promo code Hansen, Hansen. AquaTrue even comes with a 30-day best tasting water guarantee or your money back. Take the guesswork out of pure, great tasting water with this exclusive podcast only offer now at aquatrue.com, AQUATRU.com, using promo code Hansen, Hansen. We've seen in the UK former Prince Andrew come under criminal investigation. He was arrested. At a time, he said, "I'm the Queen's son. You can't do this to me." We've seen the former ambassador from the UK to the United States come under criminal investigation. There are those who believe Keir Starmer, the PM himself, is in trouble here. Are we going to, in your opinion, start to see politicians in this country face the same sort of scrutiny?
You know, I truly hope that there will be some justice in this country for what we know to be co-conspirators. I mean, let's start with the non-prosecution agreement, the sweetheart deal. There were 4 co-conspirators named in that deal that to this day have never been prosecuted, despite the fact that they had involvement in all of the conduct that Epstein was involved in, and the FBI knew about it and has evidence of it. Still not prosecuted. But I think sadly, because of the current administration we have, that we're not likely to see any further prosecutions or prosecutory, any type of action affirmatively taken to put one of these criminals behind bars.
And who are you referring to in terms of co-conspirators here?
So in the non-prosecution agreement, we had Leslie Groff, we had Nadia Marcinkova, we had Sarah Kellen. They were specifically named in the non-prosecution agreement.
And nobody seems to be aggressively pursuing or pursuing at all any of those cases.
No. Nadia Marcinkova is out there. I think she's got an Instagram page and traveling around the world as a pilot. Sarah Kellen married a gentleman from Grand Prix racing. It's almost like they're just out there laughing at the establishment saying, what I did, I got away with, and nobody's going to come after me.
And what did they do?
They were recruiters, just like Ghislaine Maxwell. The government knew that these young girls were out there recruiting other girls and bringing them into Jeffrey Epstein's orbit. That's why they were named as co-conspirators in the original agreement. They were named in the original indictment that ultimately the federal government never filed. And that's why they were there. But there seems to be absolutely no wherewithal to want to go after them or punish them. It's sad.
And I want to get into Ghislaine Maxwell in just a moment, but while we're on the subject of an indictment, a federal indictment, there was a pre-indictment memo, an actual indictment, a draft of an indictment put together prior to this plea agreement that lays all this out. And that was released as part of the files, or I don't know whether it actually got out. It was supposed to get out, then it was retracted, then it got out again. But it's for all practical purposes an actual indictment that or a proposed set of violations that was going to be taken in front of a grand jury that an assistant U.S. attorney thought they could get a prosecution on. Why did that go away? Why was that never carried out, in your opinion?
That's a great question, Chris. And we certainly didn't know back then. I think we're learning more now with the release of this information that apparently the information from higher up the chain than even the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office, they were told to get this deal done. Memos have now been released in emails that basically told Alex Acosta that he needed to get this deal done. And I'm not sure why. I could speculate, you've got information that potentially Epstein was an asset that the US government and the Israeli government were utilizing at the time. You could speculate that he was utilizing the planes that he traveled around the world in to take different things to different countries, whether it be weapons or people. There were all different kinds of theories that abounded back then, but ultimately it just came down to wealth and power and influence. And I think the federal government just dropped the ball on what we now know was likely the largest sex trafficking ring in the world back at the time.
The two leading conspiracies that are talked about in connection to the point you just made are that he was a spy for Israel or that he was an operative for Russia, and that's part of what was going on here, setting the honeypot situation and being able to have power over people who would ultimately get into politics or who were in politics or were powerful business people. I mean, Juliette Bryant came on this show to talk about how she was in South Africa when she met Epstein, and he was with President Clinton, former President Clinton at the time, and Kevin Spacey and others, in that orbit. I mean, who would think that this would be a human trafficking organization when you're with prominent people like that?
Well, not only that, but, he had Ehud Barak's phone number in his phone book on speed dial. And we know that Virginia, in her own book, in her own words, describes the violent behavior that she was subjected to by Barak. So these are people that were high up in government positions here in the US and in Israel at the time. But, it didn't stop there, right? I mean, he was close with Bill Gates. I mean, one of the largest at the time software companies in the world, a billionaire many times over, and other politicians at lower levels, financial institutions we know now, and colleges, Harvard University. I mean, princes. How do you get any higher than that at the end of the day? It was just truly unfathomable back then, the extent of his reach. and the influence that was involved. And I think the federal government was aware of that back then and just decided this was just too big a fish to be able to reel in.
Do you think that he actually had some intellectual engagement or interest and some legitimacy in the eyes of some of these people like Bill Gates? Or was this all about, hey, you guys want to meet some girls? You want to get with some women? I mean, was this just one big, uh, prostitution operation, or was there some intellectual quality to it?
I think that he liked to think himself an intellectual, but when he met with real intellectuals, they kind of realized very quickly he was not on their level. But regardless, when he's giving millions of dollars to different institutions, whether it's the Gates Foundation or whether it's Harvard University for an endowment or whether it's a political candidate, that buys him and curries him favor to enter into their world. And once he did that, then he could take those opportunities that had been purchased with his money to be able to then enter those worlds and then provide certain things for those men within those worlds that he could then use as influence over them by knowing, hey, look, you realize I've got a recording of everything that happened on my island, right? And then he could get more introductions to other people. So it was a mix, I think, of power, influence, sexual conduct, but also I think on his behalf, he liked to think himself an intellectual and he liked being able to mix it up with that crowd.
By virtually every account, the seed of his immense wealth was planted by Les Wexner and Leon Black. Do you think those two men have come clean in terms of what they really know about Epstein and what the
Absolutely
real
not.
relationship is?
Absolutely not. No, those two men are in it up to their necks, and they have only avoided prosecution because of hiding information that they have. I think at the end of the day, those two men know a lot more than what they have told the public, told under oath. I think that they have avoided being able avoided discussing information that they are well aware of occurred. And unfortunately, unless it comes out of their mouth, it's highly unlikely they end up getting prosecuted for their actions. Sadly.
Elaine Maxwell was moved to a easier, softer facility after being interviewed by the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. Um, what do you make of that? Why does that happen?
It was a deal. It was a deal cut before she ever gave the interview, right? Listen, as an inmate and working with people that have been convicted behind bars as defendants in some of my cases, I have learned very clearly that people that are convicted of sex crimes, especially against minors, they don't get any favorable treatment in prison. The prison system does not look highly upon those individuals. And at the end of the day, there's no reason for an inmate to talk to anyone. So if I had been Maxwell's defense counsel and had received a request, I don't care if it comes from the president himself, my client's going to say, no, thanks. I'm not talking to anybody because all it can do is hurt her. So in order to convince her to speak, there had to have been a pre-conversation deal and discussion between her criminal defense lawyer and the Justice Department. And in that pre-conversation deal, I guarantee you promises were made. If she talks and doesn't say a word about the president, we will move her to a nice facility where she can relax and it's like a federal day camp. That was the pre-conversation deal that likely took place before she ever opened her mouth. So she knew that if she just kept the president's name out of the conversation or even exonerated him as best she could, that she was going to get this deal and a transfer to a nicer prison. And she did. And that's what she got.
There are all these relationships now coming out in the Epstein files. Doctors who were apparently getting paid by Epstein for various reasons. Some of them headed up, research programs that maybe he was trying to show he was a philanthropic, intellectual, engaged guy here. But why all the doctors? Was some of this to treat some of the women he was trafficking? Was it to treat some of the men who were taking advantage of that? Have you looked into this, and do you have any insight?
So we knew, and I found out from touring the mansion back then during the litigation, that he had a strange fascination with dentistry for some unknown reason, because he had literally a full dentist chair with equipments in his home in Palm Beach. And then later, we saw in the photographs that were released from the island, he had a companion dental chair down there. So that was dentistry. For some reason, he had a weird fascination with making sure he was, I don't know, taken care of and didn't have to go to a dentist or would take care of others. We then also know that he had a fascination with genetics. And one of the things that he had been fascinated with is developing not a master race, but just a genetically superior person or human being. And that interested him. And he would talk with, heads of different medical departments or, different facilities that were involved in that. And he would give them funding to research some of those issues. And then lastly, we know that some of the girls that he would traffic back and forth would get injured. And it is much easier, especially someone with that much wealth, for them to have a private doctor on call that can come out to the home and treat somebody for an injury that they may have so that they don't have to report it to police or anywhere else. Because if a girl like that goes to a hospital, there are mandatory reporting laws and questions that get asked. And he certainly didn't want any of those questions being asked. These were girls that were not only US citizens, locals like my clients, but also girls that had been brought in by Jean-Luc Brunel as part of the modeling agency that he had part ownership in Miami. They were bringing these girls in from Eastern European countries. So if anything happened to one of them, he wanted to have, I'm sure, a doctor on call that could assist.
Why generate a report in an emergency room when you don't have to, I suppose?
Absolutely. If you have the money, why not?
The ranch in New Mexico has been referred to variously as a burial ground of some sort, a baby farm. You mentioned genetic superiority experiments.
Right.
What do you make of that? And I know that there's a truth council being put together by local politicians there to get to the bottom of it. But there's talk of now doing ground surveillance and X-rays to see what's underneath the ground. What kind of intelligence do you have on the ranch in New Mexico?
I would not be surprised if there was something untoward going on out at the New Mexico ranch that led to the death of someone. And again, to avoid a report, let's take a hypothetical, right? In a hypothetical situation, if you have trafficked a girl from an Eastern Bloc country and brought her here to the United States and flown her to New Mexico, and she ends up taking some drugs or doing drugs or whatever and ends up overdosing on your property out there because of a party one night or an event that occurs, you're not going to want to report that to police because you just trafficked her from another country. So what you're going to want to do is try to dispose of that body. And, one of the reasons he liked that ranch was its isolation from anyone else. So would it surprise me if they found something out at the ranch? No, sadly, I don't think it would surprise me at all. And I think that they should do extensive searches out there.
And
But in addition,
mysteriously, the married couple apparently, who ran that ranch and who were also involved in Epstein's island property, they vanished.
yeah,
Nobody can
a
find.
lot of people in Epstein's orbit seem to have just vanished. It's yeah, it's definitely curious. It's definitely something that should be investigated that unfortunately our federal government has chosen not to investigate it, but local authorities there in New Mexico should take on this investigation and should look into all potential allegations of what occurred out there and look into the facilities and search the ground. with ground penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, whatever it takes.
One of the most revealing aspects, I think, of the Epstein files has been in regards to his death, his suicide.
Right.
And there is now information coming out about a corrections officer who apparently Googled Epstein's name in the moments before his body was found, who was
Mhm.
receiving suspicious cash payments in her account uh, prior to Epstein's death. There's talk of you murdered him, you let him die. There's movement of orange clothing and cloth, a lot of inmate discussions about cover ups. Do you think he actually committed suicide, or what do you think happened here, Spencer?
Well, I have been quoted numerous times consistently. First of all, I would say that I was probably one of the first ones to be interviewed after he's arrested. And you can check the quote back. I think it was in Sun Magazine before anything happened. I said, he's not making it out of that jail alive. And sadly, that came true. This was either a monumental failure by the Department of Justice. First of all, you had two guards that allegedly fell asleep on watch. You had security cameras that were out. You had a man that was on suicide watch that they then take off of suicide watch and shortly thereafter is dead. You give an inmate who had previously been on suicide watch all kinds of sheets and clothing and cords and pills, things you should never give to somebody who potentially might want to end their life. That is a huge failure. Or he was killed. He was taken out and they had an inmate that they took care of who was allowed in to end his life. Those are really the only two options here. And I think that option two, the more we get into this and the more that we see over the years, looks a lot more credible than option one. That's the sad thing.
Well,
Now,
go ahead.
here's what I would also say, and a lot of people miss this, right? The man who made the decision that this was not murder, that this was suicide, was Bill Barr. And most people don't remember, but the first place that Epstein worked when he left school was as a teacher at a private school in New York. And the principal of that school happened to be the Attorney General's father.
Hmm.
So Barr had a personal connection with Jeffrey Epstein because his father had hired him to be a teacher at that school many years ago.
Well, the federal lockup in Manhattan has been under scrutiny for a long time, being poorly run, poorly staffed, inadequately funded. And I'm not sure how that's possible that a federal lockup in in New York City could be so poorly
Right.
run. Right. I mean, but it's true, regardless of what you think of the odds of that happening. It was a hellhole, at least at the time. So it seems to me that nobody has gotten the truth from this particular corrections officer who got cash. It came under scrutiny by the bank. Feds knew about this. She was
Yeah.
charged for a minute, but the charges were dismissed against her. Now she's living her life doing whatever, apparently still in the New York City area. I am looking for her. A lot of other people are looking for it too to get her
A lot should be
story on
looking
this.
for to ask questions.
Yeah. But I guess the real question is why didn't why didn't investigators get the truth right after this happened? And that, even if there's a good explanation for it, these are the sort of things that breed conspiracy theories. I mean, look, you and I both know that it's possible Epstein thought, okay, it's over. No matter how this plays out,
Sure.
I'm in prison for the rest of my life. I can't live this way. I'm going to hang myself. But was it his people who gave her 5 grand and allowed the camera to not work or the COs to be asleep so that he could do it? I mean, he had tried apparently
Apparently he
sometime
had. But
before, right? That's why he was on
again,
suicide watch.
yeah, you've seen the photographs of his cell.
Yeah,
There are bed sheets everywhere,
yeah.
orange bed sheets and clothing everywhere in that cell. He was given the opportunity to do what he did, and that should never occur in a locked facility like this. I mean, this is a jail where they kept the first World Trade Center bomber.
Right.
I mean, this is a highly secure prison. It's been
I
described
had
to
done
me.
interviews in that jail pre
Yeah,
9/11, but I know exactly how it's laid out. I've been in the interview rooms up there. I understand it.
it's a very secure facility where they deal with people who may be suicidal or threatening suicide every single day because of what charges are being brought against them. And he was basically given free rein. So, look, if ultimately he paid off someone so that he could do this and while they looked the other way, or whether someone took him out, frankly, it doesn't matter. This is a failure by the Department of Justice to be able to hold this man accountable. He was the one with all the answers, and they let that stop that day that he died.
What is your single biggest unanswered question still to this day, Spencer, that you would like answered?
I truly don't think that we have gotten the truth from any of the people involved about why Epstein was doing everything he did. I think there's speculation, like we had talked about today, about whether it was just personal for him and he wanted the power and influence, or whether it was just sexual for him and he liked that sexual gratification and that's what drove everything he did, or whether it was something else, some broader conspiracy or honeypot trap or some kind of CIA network. Who knows? And I don't know that we'll ever find the absolute truth behind all of this. But my hope is that as time goes by and as years pass and administrations go back into the history books, that eventually, more comes out of this story where we can truly figure out why he did it, who he was connected to, and exactly everything that actually happened.
And your clients, the survivors you represent, those civil cases have all been settled?
They have. And I think what's important also to remember, and people tend to forget this, is that survivors are not a, um, unanimous group. Some of them want to speak out. Some of them want to tell their story and discuss what happened and advocate for other victims. And that's great. We support those victims. Other victims don't want to talk about Jeffrey Epstein at all, don't want to be known. They want to continue to remain anonymous and never have to connect their name to this heinous criminal ever. Some of them have chosen to, you know, just forget about it and not even put a victim moniker on themselves and just say, that's just part of my past and I've moved past it. Every victim is different. They should all be treated as individuals and they should all be given the due respect that each one of them deserve for whatever they want.
I couldn't agree with you more. This is a platform for any of the survivors and survivors of many other atrocious crimes to speak out, and we'll always keep it that way. But I appreciate you, Spencer Kuvin, speaking out, having a seat with me. Thank you for being generous with your time. I promise you that we'll stay in touch on all of this, and I will chat with you soon.
Thank you so much, Chris. I do appreciate everything you do and everything you have done over the years. Thank you.
Well, we're going to keep doing it, and I know you will too. Spencer Kuvin, who represents 9 survivors in the Epstein case. There's just still so much going on here, and I suspect that we'll be sorting through these files for many months to come. And I promise you we'll stay on top of it right here. Remember, Predators I've Caught, I'll look back at all of our cases, drops every Monday, wherever you get your podcasts, and here on the Have a Seat with Chris Hansen YouTube channel. I'll see you next Wednesday for this Have a Seat program. And every Thursday on my streaming crime network, True Blue, you can catch another episode of Takedown with Chris Hansen, our Predator investigative series. Also, the first episode of our epic documentary into predators abusing children on the gaming platform Roblox is out now. The second hour will come out very soon. I'll keep you posted. As always, I'll be watching and listening.